The land of the long white cloud. That's what the native New Zealanders, the Maoris, call New Zealand, and here it is disappearing in the distance behind us as we sail southward. As we get farther south, we run into the first sentinels of the Antarctic Ocean. Here is an iceberg a quarter of a mile square and 1,000 feet thick that has broken off of one of the great ice shelves and is moving slowly northward to its own destruction. In this picture, the Great Glacier, our largest icebreaker, is leading the way through a 6-foot pack, which freezes about 300 miles out from the edges of the Antarctic continent every winter. The fleet follows along behind, carrying 40,000 to 50,000 tons of equipment for the forthcoming winter season. There are many bases in the Antarctic that will use those supplies up. McMurdo Sound, Wilkes, Pole, Little America, and nowadays Saiple, and out there on the Bird Plateau. This scene shows the crack that forms in a floe ahead of an icebreaker if she splits away, heading southward toward the midnight sun, which you see setting there on the southern horizon. This is the sentinel to McMurdo Sound, the bay on the westerly side of the great Ross Ice Shelf. This is Beaufort Island. On the other side, it looks like an iceberg, and sometimes we think it is. And now a bit of geography. The shaded gray patch at the bottom here is the Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf in the Ross Sea, which is about 400 miles square and is about 1,000 feet thick, floating on half a mile of seawater at its edge. The various amateur stations are situated at Cape Hallett, McMurdo, the Pole, over at Knox Coast, which was KC4USK, as you may recall. The new station at Saiple over there, just south of the peninsula that points toward South America, is KC4 AAA. Now down on the surface, we see the channels that are being cut by the icebreakers. The water here is a half a mile deep. They blow the cakes out to sea with their propellers. Then the thin-skinned cargo ships can come in. And the next picture shows this channel that they've cut in the 40-mile wide bay from a plane 30,000 feet in the air. Here is a tank truck going over the side as the ships tie up and start unloading. And here are several of the vehicles that will be used at McMurdo Station for the forthcoming winter. Here is a rubber oil tank being filled with fuel oil from one of the tankers, which is then carried up to the base 8 miles away in 50-gallon oil drums that are dragged by sleds and small tractors. And now we see Observation Hill in the distance. That's where Scott had his 1910 camp, and that's where our present McMurdo base is located. The airfield is on the ice in the foreground. It's 8 miles from this ship to Observation Hill back there, which looks a little bit more like this. On top of Observation Hill is a cross erected to Sir Robert Falcon Scott, who died there in 1911. I'm sorry, 1912. And here is a finback whale, about 60 feet long, with 2/3 of his length ahead of the fin, cruising along in one of the passageways we've just cut as he comes up for air. And now as we get closer to the base there at McMurdo Sound, we see some of the airplanes on the bay ice down below the hill where the camp is located. This picture shows us the main street of McMurdo, which we call McMudhole in the spring when the ice is melting. Off in the distance, 40 miles away, we can see the great peaks of the Royal Society Range that rise 3 miles into the air. No one's ever been in them. It's too rugged. They're 80 miles away in this photograph. Right near the base, we come on the buildings that were used by Scott in his 1902 expedition. Investigate, find the old seal carcasses and some of the food still edible. This is Sir Ernest Shackleton's base. a few miles north on Cape Royds. The little lake there is where he got his fresh water. This scene is Cape Evans, where Scott built his 1910 house, the one from which he traveled and died. Here, three of us are standing in front of the house as we went over there to reclaim some of the ancient artifacts for the New Zealand museums a few years ago. This view was inside of the buildings as we found them after they'd been unoccupied for 60 years. Here is one of the dry batteries that I brought back to the museum at Holcomb, New York, after it had been exposed to the weather for 60 years. And this is the piece of the first antenna wire ever used in the Antarctic back in 1907 by Ernest Shackleton. Here's a view on the outside of the camp with some of the piles of debris that we shoveled out to put the rest of the house in order. And here are some of the boxes of trail rations, trail biscuits that are still edible after being out there on the snow 60 years. This plaque is on the surface, is on the outside surface of the building where visitors can read the history and pay proper respect. And now, in our little helicopter, we come back to land on the flight deck of the Glacier as the sun is going down for another night. And the next slide shows the Mount Discovery off in the distance, named by Scott in 1902, but a typical sunset, and some of the beauties of the Antarctic. Here is a C-135, great cargo plane, that makes the average trip to the pole and back in about 7 hours nowadays. I flew in there in 1961, my first time, and the next picture shows the nose of the aircraft as it goes over some of those 3-mile mountains, 3-mile-high mountains down below from an altitude of 35,000 feet. Here's a better view of them. Rugged country. Imagine walking up there as Scott and Amundsen did with their dogs and their skis back there in the old days. Not for me, boy. And now we're at the pole itself. This is the scene at KC-4USN. The flag flying, antennas buried in some places, the buildings underneath the surface. This is the radar in this dome that helps the aircraft find a place in heavy weather. The altitude is 9,000 feet, which means with only 9,000 feet of snow that part of this land beneath it is beneath the level of the sea. And here's the old man of the mountain standing at the South Pole with a silver ball on top. And as you may notice, there's a Mystic River sign there at the left. A lot of us came from New England. This is the world's southernmost tip. The next picture shows some of the Navy broadband vertical antennas on the snow there. Snow 9,000 feet thick, remember, 150 feet down, it's hard ice. After our visit, we fly rapidly back to KC-4USV at McMurdo, and here's a view of the famous Mount Erebus, the only active volcano in the Antarctic, 13,000 feet high from an icebreaker out in the middle of McMurdo Sound. Now, after our visit, we travel eastward along the reaches of the Great Ross Ice Shelf, which is 1,000 feet thick, as I told you, and 4,000 miles long. Here's what it looks like from a distance. All of that is freshwater ice.